This is Whisper from History, where forgotten voices rise again. Friends, today's story may sound like fiction, but believe me, it is entirely true. So stay with me until the end and uncover this reality. The story begins in the shadows of post-war America, a time when fear and secrecy wrapped the nation like a heavy cloak. The year was the early 1950s, and the United States found itself locked in a chilling contest with the Soviet Union. The Cold War was not just about nuclear weapons or military might. It was about minds. Intelligence agencies on both sides were gripped by a terrifying question. Could the human brain be controlled, manipulated, even weaponized? The CIA, born only a few years earlier, in 1947, saw itself at the forefront of this battle. Whispers of Soviet and Chinese mind control experiments circulated through Washington, feeding paranoia at the highest levels. American prisoners returning from the Korean War reported bizarre confessions and behaviors. Officials worried that communists had discovered a way to break a man's will and reprogram his thoughts. Out of this paranoia came a desperate and secret mission: to unlock the secrets of the human mind before the enemy did. The project would be given a cryptic name: MKUltra. It was a sprawling, clandestine program that tested everything from hypnosis to electroshock therapy. But at its heart was a powerful new drug that had just arrived in America: lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD. This strange compound, synthesized in Switzerland by chemist Albert Hofmann, promised a doorway into altered states of consciousness. To CIA officials, it was more than just a psychedelic curiosity. They saw it as a possible truth serum, a weapon of psychological warfare, even a tool to control entire populations. But how could such a drug be tested? How could one measure the effects of something that seemed to dissolve reality itself? For the CIA, the answer lay not in laboratories alone, but in the hidden corners of American society. They needed unwitting subjects, people who would never suspect they were part of an experiment. And so, a subproject of MKUltra was born. Its codename carried an almost surreal darkness: Operation Midnight Climax. At first glance, the idea seemed pulled from a pulp novel. The CIA rented safehouses in San Francisco and later in New York. Inside, they created spaces designed to look like intimate hideaways, complete with luxurious furniture, dim lighting, and two-way mirrors. Prostitutes were recruited and paid by the agency, not just for their company but for their cooperation. Their task was simple and chilling: lure unsuspecting men to these safehouses, slip LSD into their drinks, and let the agency watch what happened next. Behind the mirrors, CIA operatives sat with clipboards, cameras, and recording devices. They observed every detail: the nervous laughter of a man who thought he was on a date, the moment his reality began to unravel, the confusion and panic as hallucinations took hold. The officers took notes, not about romance or conversation, but about dosage, behavior, and breakdowns. It was not science as the public imagined it. It was voyeurism, weaponized in the service of Cold War fears. One of the central figures in this strange theater was a man named George Hunter White. White was not a scientist, nor a medical researcher. He was a veteran of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a man who had spent his career chasing criminals in the underworld. He was known for his flamboyant personality, his drinking, and his bravado. When the CIA approached him to run Operation Midnight Climax, he accepted eagerly. To White, it was an assignment that combined his love for undercover work with a surreal kind of power. He ran the safehouses with a mixture of discipline and decadence, stocking them with liquor, surveillance equipment, and of course, LSD. White later wrote in his diary that he had enjoyed the work immensely, though his words reveal a disturbing sense of detachment. He described watching men unravel under the influence of drugs they did not know they had taken. all while sipping martinis and joking with his colleagues. To him, the safe houses were laboratories. To the men inside, they were traps. For the prostitutes involved, the story was even more complex. Some were told they were helping their country, that their work was patriotic. Others were simply in it for the money. They played their roles with precision, knowing that the men they brought in were being used as pawns in an experiment they themselves could barely comprehend. Their own safety and dignity mattered little to the agency. They were tools, just like the drugs and mirrors. The experiments were deeply invasive. Some of the men were ordinary citizens who wandered into bars looking for companionship. Others were known criminals or addicts targeted by the agency. None of them gave consent. None of them were told they were part of a government experiment. They were chosen precisely because they could not fight back. The line between research and abuse had blurred beyond recognition. As the years passed, the safe houses became symbols of the program's recklessness. The CIA wanted to know how much LSD a man could take before losing control. They wanted to know if the drug could extract secrets, erase memories, or plant suggestions. They even studied whether it could be used in interrogation, whether an enemy's spy might be broken down by visions so powerful that his mind would shatter. The experiments produced piles of notes, but very little usable science. The data was chaotic, unstructured, and often meaningless. Yet the program continued, fueled by paranoia and secrecy. What is perhaps most haunting about Operation Midnight Climax is not just the science, but the moral void it exposed. The men who walked into those safe houses were stripped of their agency. They were denied the basic right to know what was being done to their bodies and minds. The prostitutes who participated were themselves caught in webs of manipulation, both exploiting and being exploited. And the agents who watched from behind the glass seemed more like voyeurs than scientists, indulging in the spectacle rather than advancing knowledge. By the early 1960s, LSD was escaping the confines of government labs. Writers, artists, and musicians began experimenting with it on their own terms, sparking the counterculture revolution that would define a generation. Ironically, the very drug the CIA had tried to weaponize became a symbol of freedom, rebellion, and expanded consciousness. Yet the government's darker experiments remained hidden from the public eye. It was not until the 1970s that the truth began to surface. In the wake of the Watergate scandal, a wave of congressional investigations sought to uncover abuses of power by intelligence agencies. Among the most shocking revelations was the existence of MKUltra and its sub-projects. Journalists and lawmakers uncovered fragments of documents, testimonies from former officials, and stories from victims who had never understood what had happened to them. The details were staggering. Experiments conducted without consent, doses of LSD given to prisoners, psychiatric patients, and even hospital staff. And then there were the safe houses, where intimacy had been turned into a weapon of state surveillance. George Hunter White had retired by then, leaving behind cryptic notes about his time with the agency. He expressed little regret, insisting that he had simply done his duty in the shadow war against communism. But for the men who had stumbled into those trap-like rooms, and for the women who were used as bait, the damage was irreversible. Some victims described years of psychological trauma, paranoia, and broken trust. Others never even realized they had been experimented upon, living their lives haunted by experiences they could not explain. The exposure of Operation Midnight Climax forced Americans to confront an unsettling truth, that their own government had treated its citizens as expendable in the name of national security. It was not a story of heroism or victory. It was a story of fear turned inward, of power unchecked, of morality abandoned in the pursuit of control. The safe houses of San Francisco and New York were dismantled, their mirrors taken down, their walls emptied, but the legacy remained, a cautionary tale about what happens when secrecy overrides ethics. For decades afterward, survivors, historians, and activists demanded accountability. Lawsuits were filed, though few succeeded. The CIA insisted much of the documentation had been destroyed in 1973 on orders from director Richard Helms. Without records, victims struggled to prove their cases. The government issued limited apologies, but many felt they were hollow. The scars of the program were deeper than words could heal. Today, Operation Midnight Climax stands as one of the most bizarre and troubling chapters in the history of American intelligence. It reads like fiction, a surreal tale of prostitutes, drugs, and spies. But it was real, funded by taxpayer money, executed under the guise of patriotism, and hidden from the public for decades. It was a story that revealed how fear can warp judgment, how secrecy can breed abuse, and how even the most democratic of nations can stumble into darkness when it believes the ends justify the means. The Cold War eventually ended. The Soviet Union collapsed, and the paranoia that gave birth to MKUltra faded, but the memory of those experiments remains, lingering like a shadow on the conscience of a nation. The men who were drugged without their knowledge, the women who were used as bait, the agents who watched from behind the glass, they are all part of a history that asks us to remember the cost of unchecked power. And in that remembering lies the lesson. A warning from the past about the fragile boundary between security and freedom, between protecting a nation and betraying its people. For in the safe houses of Operation Midnight Climax, America glimpsed not just the edge of science, but the edge of its own soul. So you have heard the story of Operation Midnight Climax, a tale that shows how fear and secret power can drag humanity to its lowest depths. And that is why we say, in the darkness of history, every hidden whisper carries a lesson. This was CIA Operation, part of our Dark History collection, but the shadows don't end here. In this playlist, you'll uncover more untold stories, equally chilling, equally unforgettable. So keep watching the Dark History playlist, and subscribe to Whisper from History, where every whisper reveals a shadow the past tried to hide. This video is narrated by an AI voice, script and editing done by human.